Please be seated. Debate continues on the Standards in Public Life Bill 2013. Does any other member wish to speak? I acknowledge the Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be brief, and I would first like to congratulate the Honorable Premier in bringing this legislation to this Honorable House. And so I rise to say that I too will be supporting a bill for the law to preserve and promote the integrity of public officials and institutions for incidental and connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, I would regard this as a comprehensive piece of legislation, but as well as being comprehensive, Mr. Speaker, it's also proportionate. It's not doing more than is necessary to ensure that those who are in public office or in public life somewhat, or public servants, are held to the highest standards, and of course that they should be men and women of integrity. And Mr. Speaker, I recall last year, in the early months of the year, there was a lecture at the UCCI, and it was Professor Trevor Monroe from Jamaica. And at the time, of course, there was a raging debate as to whether parties were the worst thing on earth, or if individuals were inherently better. And I recall he mentioned that there was some survey done in the Eastern Caribbean where they thought that, I think it was St. Lucia and St. Vincent, perhaps, I think it was those two countries. But the scores that were given did not directly correlate to the perception that parties were inherently corrupt. And I recall rising to ask a question of Mr. Monroe. And the question was, is it really the case that it is the party system that lends itself to corruption? Or is it the case that it is individuals who become members of parties that are inherently corrupt? And I distinctly recall that he couldn't really answer the question. And Mr. Speaker, the relevance of that, what I've just said, is for the simple reason to say that I am extremely pleased that this legislation goes beyond just elected members. Because I've always been a law-abiding citizen. I've always tried to live from what I earn. I have certain beliefs and principles by which I live. But I do recognize that now that I am a member of Parliament, and as has been correctly said in this room, in this House, just by virtue of being in that position, people will now point fingers at you. But I'm firmly of the belief that it is possible to be a representative of the people and to be an honest representative, to enter and leave a political life as honest as you entered. So, having said that, Mr. Speaker, because corrupt individuals is not something that is unique to public life or political life, this legislation now extends to those who may, for whatever reason, decide that the way to enrich oneself is to avoid public scrutiny as a member of parliament, but position oneself in a particular position to benefit from certain information or contracts or whatever. So this legislation, Mr. Speaker, ought to make the general public extremely pleased that everyone now is on a level playing field. And as having spent some years in the civil service and now I'm in Parliament, I'm able to see things from both perspectives. And I'm not saying that anyone in the civil service is in any way corrupt, but this legislation, as well as it holds Parliament accountable, it also holds the civil service accountable. Because there is this perception that only politicians are corrupt. I believe that individuals are corrupt, not institutions. Mr. Speaker, I also mentioned that it is proportionate. Proportionate in the sense that you are only required to disclose only those interests that where conflicts are likely to arise or may be perceived as a conflict with the functions on the entities in which the individual is appointed to serve. So it's not asking for a list of every asset you own or every organization that you have some links to, but only those that will relate to the function that you will perform and the service that you'll provide to your country. Mr. Speaker, I also welcome the protection in this legislation that is given to whistleblowers, because for a very long time, it's a very small community. You see things, you aren't absolutely certain, but there is someone who knows. But out of fear of victimization, out of fear of being ostracized, out of fear of maybe not having a job, no one would say anything. So for many, many years, we've seen many people, and I would say years in the sense of decades, because I sometimes spend a lot of time people watching. So we now have legislation that covers and protects those who have the courage and the moral fiber within them to report what they know to be illegal. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that for those of us who are in support of this bill, it says a lot that we are willing to do this to protect those who might otherwise be victimized. Mr. Speaker, the bill also goes further in that it makes it an offense, or in the sense that you can be held in contempt of the Legislative Assembly as a member if you fail to do what is the correct thing to do, and that is to provide information to update the register. Mr. Speaker, I recall in the last couple years where there was great controversy as to whether or not there were meetings or whether or not they should be having meetings for the committee that dealt with the register of interest. This legislation removes that requirement now, and every member is required now to provide their information to the Commission on Standards in Public Life. So we will no longer have those discussions, we will no longer have those quarrels. If you don't play, then you're out of the game. And I think that's a wonderful thing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we hold ourselves out as public figures and we ask the public to elect us to office, then I think it's only fair that the public should know what we acquire while we are in these chambers. We are public servants, and we did say that we were coming here for the public's interest. So, as I've said before, I think it's both comprehensive yet proportionate. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to stand here and be on public record as giving my support to this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I recognize the Honorable Minister for Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a very short contribution in support of a bill for a law to preserve and promote the integrity of public officials and institutions and for the incidental and connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, the bill, the Standards in Public Life, Bill 2013. First, I'd like to compliment the Premier for bringing it and piloting it. Based on all the other members that have spoken, I think we see safe passage ahead of it. I'd also like to address just a few points in it. The bill seeks to repeal the Register of Interests Law of 1996. Mr. Chairman, this Register of Interest has served us, and it served us for a long period of time, as we've heard by some of the speakers earlier. Basically, what that did, the Register of Interest Law Schedule 1 required the following persons to register their interests: the elected members, the Legislative Assembly, the Speaker, the Chief Secretary, now the Deputy Governor, the Attorney General, the Financial Secretary, and candidates nominated for election to the Assembly. That will all stay the same under this bill, Mr. Chairman, under this new legislation. But what actually takes place with Section 117 of the Constitution, Order of 2009 for the Cayman Islands, it provides for the establishment of the Commission of Standards in Public Life. So basically what we are doing today is regularizing the Constitution. And it's in the new Constitution, functions are also stipulated that one of these is the duty to supervise the operation, registered interests referred to in Section 112, and investigate breaches of established standards in public life. This bill seeks to implement the Constitution in that respect significantly. This bill is interesting because it not only wraps in the register that is in place now, but it also extends the scope of the bill to public officers, whom now disclosure will also apply. So it adds more transparency, Mr. Speaker, to the way business is done here in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, it also, under Clause 4, sets out how the commission will be appointed, which I think is extremely important. The commission will be appointed by the governor, but it will not be appointed until the governor consults with the premier and the Leader of the Opposition. It provides that the Commission shall not be under the control of any other person or authority. This, I believe, brings safety and balance to the Commission itself, that it'll have the ability to carry out the duties that the Constitution has set out for it to do. Mr. Speaker, it provides for the details of how disclosures relating to conflict of interest. We've heard about the importance of the statutory authorities and the government boards. These government boards and also the public that is now mandated to disclosure have the ability through this legislation to understand how the conflicts of interest are to be mitigated, and to ensure that a person who has an interest in a matter not only discloses it, but also does not directly or indirectly participate in decision making. Mr. Speaker, it also goes on to give comfort to the board members that we've talked about that so willingly give their time and their expertise and perform a duty that most of them are not paid for. It sets out, Mr. Speaker, that a board member will be a person that has skills, knowledge, integrity to carry out the duties required in a highly competent and politically neutral way as they're appointed to a board. But it also, I think, very importantly points out for the board members, for balance, where there's a possible or perceived conflict of interest with respect to any matter that comes up for discussion, a person in public life shall disclose his interest and shall, as soon as the matter comes up on the agenda, immediately leave the place in which deliberations are taking place and shall not participate directly or indirectly in deliberations, shall otherwise comply with such regulations as Cabinet may make with regard to conflict of interest. And a declaration of interest made under this section and the absence of the member concerned shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. So, Mr. Speaker, that sets out the balance for not only the public sector, but also the statutory authorities and the mitigation of conflicts which in our small country will always arise when we all are participating in good governance and moving the country forward. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this legislation is very important for the people of the country and also for the investors, from the tourism standpoint and the people that are coming here to visit us, to invest here, to look at opportunities. They look for things like this, Mr. Speaker, and this gives them much comfort for when they make the decision of where they're going to invest and participate in businesses. So I'm happy to lend voice, join voice with all of the other members who have spoke and support this bill when the vote comes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does the mover of the bill wish to exercise his right of reply?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by thanking all members of this Honorable House who have spoken for their contributions and for their support of this important piece of legislation. I want to also thank those who have not spoken for their tacit support of the bill. Mr. Speaker, I want to especially thank the Leader of the Opposition, who gave a very long and comprehensive address indicating his wholehearted support of the bill. Mr. Speaker, I have to say, though, that as he spoke, I thought about the Apostle Paul and his conversion on the road to Damascus. Because it became apparent to me as we worked at this bill that this bill had actually come to the cabinet, which was led by the leader of the opposition, not once, but twice, and had been deferred in each instance. So, Mr. Speaker, for whatever reason, I am happy that the bill which we presented today, which I presented today, now enjoys the support of the entire House, including the leader of the opposition. Mr. Speaker, I wish to address some specific points which were raised by the member for North Side. At one point, he suggested that changes should be made to clause 4(1)(c), which states that a legal practitioner who has practiced in the Commonwealth is one of the requirements of, or one of the conditions under which a person may be appointed a member of the commission. But, Mr. Speaker, the difficulty with that is that the legislation simply mirrors the provisions in the Constitution itself. And so we're not able to depart from those. Another point which he made was that he wanted changes to clause 2B and C to make them uniform. That is, Mr. Speaker, the provisions which said that you'd be disqualified from holding the office if you had held in the preceding 3 years a public office, or if you had been held office in a political party in the preceding 5 years, and he wished them to be the same. Again, these provisions mirror those in the Constitution. He also suggested that clause 5, subclause 3, which gives to the governor the power to decide that a particular report is not in the public interest, and that the governor ought not to have this unilateral power. Mr. Speaker, we have consulted with the Honorable Attorney General, who has confirmed that it is appropriate for the governor to have that power in these particular circumstances. Mr. Speaker, the same honorable member also referred to clause 12(1)(c), which provides that, let me just turn up the section, the clause. Clause 1L, I apologize. Which says, is the section dealing with the declarations that ought to be made, and having set out in extenso a whole range of interests which have to be declared by members, it then goes on to provide, and such other details as Cabinet may prescribe in regulations. And the objection of the member seemed to be that Cabinet ought not to have this power, and that they ought to be, if the changes are to be made, they ought to be done by the House. Mr. Speaker, the view of the Cabinet is that, the view of the government is that Cabinet, this is not an unusual provision at all, and that Cabinet ought to have this ability to add other interests which appear to the government to be important to be disclosed rather than having, and to be able to do so in cabinet rather than having to bring an amending bill to the House. Mr. Speaker, the same member also suggested that declarations should be kept for a longer period, that is, he suggested 5 years. The bill says at the moment that they will be kept for at least 3 years. We have no issue on this side, Mr. Speaker, in changing this. If this is the will of the House, we can do so at the committee stage. And I would suggest to the member that if he is still pressing for this particular point, that he should move the appropriate amendment during the committee stage debate. Mr. Speaker, the same member also suggested that the Commission should have the power to prosecute persons themselves. Again, Mr. Speaker, there is a constitutional bar to this responsibility for criminal prosecutions vests in the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And so I'm afraid we can't, even if we wish to, we can't accede to that particular proposal. And he also suggested that where the bill provides that Cabinet may do certain things throughout the proposed legislation, that those should be changed to Cabinet shall. Having reviewed that, Mr. Speaker, we are of the view that the bill as drafted is the way that we wish it to be, that Cabinet has the permissive power to do certain things, not that Cabinet is required to do them as the change would require. The member also pointed out in clause 24 that clause said that references keeping declarations private is contradictory to the bill, and he's right. And there is a committee stage amendment proposed with respect to that. I have to confess, Mr. Chairman, that my note of what the member said with respect to Part 6, Section 26, or Clause 26, Subclause 1, where the section says, or where the clause says that Cabinet is to choose the board members and then to choose from those board members a chairperson. He seemed to suggest that there was something problematic about that, but I haven't been able to understand quite what the issue was. In committee stage, if it is still a point which the member wishes to press, then we can perhaps seek to resolve that. Mr. Speaker, the member from East End inquired as to whether we need to say anything about indemnities already in place for statutory boards. We don't think that that is the case. The indemnities are with respect to any, shall I call it, honest mistake made during the course of or the execution of the duties of the board member. In that case, anyone can make an honest mistake, and the indemnities given would require government to cover whatever the consequences of that are. But those are only with respect to actions which are lawful, though mistaken perhaps, and which are carried out within the scope of the mandate of the particular board. If someone goes off on a frolic of their own, the indemnities won't cover what they do, and they will have to deal with the consequences of any consequences that flow from that. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition raised the point about the Governor not being subject to the legislation. As I believe has been pointed out, to him, there's a constitutional bar to that occurring. And indeed, if that were to be pursued, as he has pointed out, it would require change to the Constitution. I believe, Mr. Speaker, I have covered all of the, or I shouldn't say all, the main points that we discerned from the debate of members of the House that required some change or proposed some change to the legislation. I spoke at some length when I introduced the bill, Mr. Speaker, and I don't propose to rehearse that. I just wish to conclude by paying a special thanks and recording the gratitude of the House and the country as a whole to the current and previous members of the Commission on Standards for Public Life, who have worked diligently over the course of these past years, not only to get the Commission up and running, but to propose, to consider carefully the Constitution and the requirements of the Commission, and to put together the necessary drafting instructions to have the bill that is before the House drafted, and who have since considered many times and for a number of years the impact of those provisions, responded to criticisms, concerns, as recently as last night, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker. So I wish to pay tribute to the current and the first and current chairperson, Mrs. Karen Martinez-Thompson, Mrs. Naidame Flatley, Mr. Headley Robinson, Mr. Ian White, and to previous members of the Commission, Mr. Roy McTaggart and Pastor Winston Rose, for their hard work, for their industry, for their commitment to having this through. And I also, Mr. Speaker, wish to pay tribute to the hard work, dedication of the members of the legal drafting team who have put this together, who have responded to all of the concerns, who have made the changes and the adjustments. I would start naming some names, but because I haven't been around from the start, I am bound to leave someone out, but I know that some of them are here, and certainly Mr. Bilikas Samamba, I know, has been intimately involved with this, and I wish to express my gratitude and that of the government to him and the entire team for all that they have done with respect to this particular bill and what they do generally, for which they usually don't get sufficient acknowledgement and thanks. And so, Mr. Speaker, again, I wish to record my gratitude to all members of the House for their support of this important piece of legislation. I think that history will be kind to us for having put in place yet another tenet of the good governance framework, which is so critically important to this country. I am pleased to have been associated with two previous important pieces of governance legislation, the Freedom of Information legislation and the anti-corruption legislation, and this is yet another limb, if I may say that, to that growing tree of governance in the Cayman Islands. I think that all in Cayman and more broadly will applaud the efforts and the unanimity of this legislature in approving this important piece of legislation. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, after last night, they were still quarreling over it.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Standards in Public Life Bill 2013 be given a second reading.
The reason why they go through cabinet is
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, no.
the wide,
The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker. Of course I'm serious.
Madam Clerk.
If I could trust you, I wouldn't have asked you, but I can't trust you.
Honorable Alden McLaughlin.
Aye.
Honorable Moses Colonel.
Aye.
Honorable Kurt Tibbetts.
Aye.
Honorable Osborne Bawden.
Aye.
Honorable William Panton.
Aye.
Honorable Marco Archer.
Aye.
Honorable Tara Rivers.
Aye.
Honorable Mr. Winston Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Roy McTaggart.
Aye.
Mr. Joseph Hugh.
Aye.
Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Honorable Kiva Bush.
Aye.
Mr. Borny Bush. Captain Eugene Ebanks.
Aye.
Mr. Ezra Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Orden McLean.
Aye.
The results of the division, 15 ayes, no noes, passed unanimously. Therefore, the Standards in Public Life Bill 2013 has been given a second reading. Honorable Premier, as we approach within a few minutes of the hour of adjournment, I would ask if you would move the motion thusly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I adjourn this Honorable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
The question is that this House do not adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow, the 31st of January. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, no. The ayes have it. This Honorable House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.